and they almost like politically, I don't know, for whatever reason, those marginalize the work that's coming out of Taiwan. And it broke my heart because I admire him a lot. You know, Professor Yang, he's this real kind of very honorable Confucian gentleman. I mean, he's really bossy, okay, and you know, but he's really amazing as well. And essentially, his article on this indigenous compatibility is saying that there are these multiple indigenous psychologies, but you've got to know the internal logic of the indigenous psychology itself before you should start fusing or comparing it with others. So I think this is actually exactly what's happening in Aotearoa New Zealand, is that Māori are driving very hard to figure out what is a Māori indigenous psychology. And I don't think that they're philosophically opposed to this broader thing that you're talking about. It's just a matter of prioritization. If you have no base, where do you stop? And so if you look at what Māori are doing, it's very similar to what Guo Shuyang proposed for indigenous psychology in Taiwan, his do's and don'ts and things like that. They're all about strengthening your own base first, so that what you produce is not a colonized or an assimilated psychology. It is a psychology that has that indigenous compatibility, right? And the counter, okay, that people who don't like indigenous psychology will say is, well then, how many indigenous psychologies do we need? Okay? So in the Philippines, you have this poor country with 19 million people. How many indigenous psychologists do we need? Do we need one for every language group? We were just in America. I think there are 4,000 native language groups in North America. Do we need an indigenous psychology for each of them? Who would that serve? Would that serve the people themselves? Or would that be actually serving the mainstream, because the small groups would be so divided amongst themselves they wouldn't have any power? So anyone want to kind of take that on?
Well, I think that people define themselves in terms of culture, and the cultures are different, then by all means they should have like their own indigenous psychology, because it will differ from perspective to the next. But like Yang said as well, that in the pyramid it goes to the next level where you integrate that process. So you come to that point and then you try to integrate and compare or find commonalities and then
Okay, so who's going to do the integration?
Well, that's a hard one. I don't know.
Yeah. So I think, for instance, for me, just to use the example of the bicultural, because I live in New Zealand, I'm a citizen of this country. I would say that, for instance, in our dynamic here, whenever Kiri and I present together, she takes a straight indigenous perspective, and I'll generally take a bicultural perspective. So we play a kind of a complementary role in what we do, and we play off of one another and stuff like that. So, but you've got to have that type of a relational structure in order to be able to do that, and both sides have to be willing to do that. So the bicultural person has to be willing to subordinate themselves and sometimes, and just listen to the indigenous. And the indigenous has to listen sometimes and say, well, this does connect to the other cultures in New Zealand as well. So it's very interesting who's going to play that role and how it will play out. I think it's very hard for a single individual to do all of them. And Guo Shuyang, by the way, is probably the most eminent Chinese psychologist. And I think he tries to play that integrative role, but I think he struggles with it because he has trouble. What he wants to do is to move indigenous, he calls it Chinese psychology. He would never admit that it was Taiwanese psychology. Indigenous Chinese psychology to the level where it's as big as what he calls American indigenous psychology. The Americans will never in 1,000 million years admit that what they have is an indigenous psychology. Okay, they will never admit that. They have a universal psychology for humanity. And so there isn't that willingness to engage in the dialogue. And so you don't see K.S. Young as a hugely salient figure in global psychology, where the kinds of integrations that he made, for instance, he made a double Y theory, talking about what type of motivational structures collectivist Chinese have compared to individualists, comparing the Chinese motivational psychology with Maslow's hierarchy of needs, for instance. Because for collectivists, very few collectivists will accept Maslow's hierarchy of needs. Because Maslow's hierarchy of needs pretty much puts individual, personal, transcendental psychology at the peak, if you interpret it at a more shallow level. I think that actually Maslow is an incredibly deep and spiritual human being. And at the deepest spiritual level, the self-actualizing person is actually quite universally and culturally located. But anyway, that's what K.S. Young did. So you see, he hasn't had a long-term collaboration with an American psychologist that's enabled him to make impact. So he actually has a lot less impact than the cross-cultural psychologists like Hazel Marcus and Shinobu Kiriyama, because they're really dialoguing back and forth. Okay? So if you're going to play this game of integration, this dialoguing and these partnerships and these relationships are really, really important. So, I mean, the point when I can't get Kitty to teach this class with me, or someone else equally, well, not equally, almost as qualified as him, I don't think I'd actually be comfortable teaching this course. You see what I'm saying? It's a different dynamic. The way that I would present this course is, I mean, I do the best that I can, but I am who I am, and I have my limitations. And so it is that dialogue that is really central if you're going to do that. Okay, any other just open-ended reflections before we dive into the questions? Open-ended? Yeah.
What I found quite interesting, I'm Kate. What I found quite interesting in the last two readings was when they were talking about how Māori people aren't as sort of comfortable in like a European education setting. You kind of think, oh yeah, okay, and I always just take that as face value. I've heard it all my life and that kind of stuff. But then when you actually read that, and it was like 1907 or something, that they actually put in place structures that stopped Māori people from learning in a Māori way. I mean, as a European, I've never been taught that because, you know, Māori schools wouldn't teach that. But then you can actually see how far, I found it quite interesting to see how far back it goes and how limiting, how hard it is now that we've got like Te Wānanga, which is more, I suppose, Māori orientated and you would learn more in a Māori way, but it's taken this long. And I never really realised how imposing the Western sort of education system and how hard now it would be for Māori to get back that, I can't remember the word, but the Māori teachers of medicine and that kind of a thing. How hard it would be not only to get those people back into the system and get them teaching like Māori young people that are coming through, but also how hard it would be to get Māori to support that a bit more. You know, it's been so eradicated, and I thought, I've never heard that before, so I was quite surprised at how much we've actually gone out of our way to stomp it out, you know, and how lacking it is in our system now. It's just been completely like that.
Well, Kira, you might want to respond to that since you were one of the authors of that little...
Yeah, it's raised, your kōrero has raised a few issues for me. One of them is that although, you know, we appear to be doing well with the development of wānanga and wharekura, which are Māori secondary schools, and kura kaupapa Māori, which are primary schools, and kohanga reo, which are our preschools. The standards upon which they are based are still dominated by Pākehā government priorities. The place of the language, I mean, it looks like for all intents and purposes that we're doing really well